Next, we're going to discuss energy flow and in the life of a cell, lesson 4. Energy flow, of course, is making sure that things can move from one point to another point through active transport and to allow other life processes to be done that need energy. Energy in general, and this really has nothing to do with biology, this slide, this is really more physics, but it's really very, very basic physics. And energy means the capacity or the ability to do work, which means to move an object, to move any object. When I pick up a pen and put it back down, I am doing work. Work requires some sort of energy. Energy can be mechanical energy, which we're not really going to focus on very much. Things like when you chew your food or when you smack something with your hand or anything that's mechanical energy. The energy when it comes to food and the energy that food gives you is really chemical energy, which is the ability to do work through manipulation of atoms, molecules, things like that. Chemical energy is available in the bonds of molecules. Really the way your body works in terms of producing energy. It stores energy in ATPs, adenosine triphosphates. Well, when there's no energy in it, it's an ADP, which is a diphosphate. Again, that's a little bit more complex than we're going to go into right now, but that's basically a form of chemical energy that your body uses. Energy can be potential, which means it is stored, which means you can harness it, you can use it. If I pick up a pen and I hold it 5 feet above the ground, it has potential energy because all I need to do is let it go and it will fall down, and I don't know if you heard that, but that was the pen falling on my desk. Kinetic energy is the energy of actual movements. Now, so when it comes to food, when it comes to biology, energy in food, the 100 calories in your piece of bread, that is potential energy. The kinetic energy is when the energy is actually being utilized by your body. So, for example, to pick up the piece of bread and put it into your mouth, that uses kinetic energy, and it also puts it into your body where your body is able to release the stored potential energy as kinetic energy. Kinetic energy can be turned into potential energy, and potential energy can be turned into kinetic energy, or whatever. They each can be turned into each other very simply. Just one quick example, picking up a pen, I'm using kinetic energy to pick it up, it now has potential energy. I let it go, the potential energy is now being converted back into kinetic energy as the pen falls. Another quick example, plummeting a roller coaster car is turning kinetic when the roller coaster goes up, 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 up. It's using kinetic energy. Now it's high above the ground. It's got potential energy, and then when it comes back down the other side, it is now using kinetic energy and losing the potential energy. Food, as we discussed, has potential energy, and photosynthesis is when the plant makes its own food, when the plant makes in its chloroplasts, creates sugar, and it creates sugar potential energy that the plant can later use using the kinetic energy of the sunlight. A couple of other rules, also in physics, that are relevant to biology in our case are the rules of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed by ordinary processes. It can only be converted from potential energy to kinetic energy, back to potential, back to kinetic, etc. You also, of course, when you use energy, when you run around, when you sweat, or whatever it is, you're causing an increase of the molecular movement. When you cause molecules to move faster, you're causing things to get hotter. In other words, the energy is just being transferred from place to place and from object to object. It's not actually being lost or gained. Nuclear reactions are a different issue, but I don't even want to get into that. That's not really an issue relevant to biology and life processes. In a closed system, where energy cannot enter and cannot leave, the total energy always stays the same. The total amount of energy out there always stays the same. It may be converted, it may be changed form. It used to be when you run around and you are using the potential energy originally existed in the food that you ate, and then it converted into kinetic energy when your body converted it into the energy necessary for you to run, and then that generated more heat, and that heat caused your sweat molecules to evaporate in the air, and then the air is becoming a little hotter because of your kinetic energy, and the energy. But there's always the energy there's always energy there. It's just a question of which form it takes. The second law of thermodynamics is that when energy is converted from one form to another, the amount of useful energy, in other words, the amount of energy that you can actually use and harness, decreases. It's related to the rule of entropy, which says that things tend to get spread apart and less organized as they get further apart. An example is a very simple example. When you exercise, you burn the food that you have in you, the sugar molecules, the fat molecules, those are potential energy. They have energy stored in them. Then, when you exercise, you use kinetic energy to burn the food or cause energy to be received from the food. And that energy that you produce is given off into the person's surroundings and makes the area around you a little bit hotter, as we discussed before. How do you get energy into the earth? The answer, of course, is basically sunlight. Because all the energy that we get in our systems ultimately comes from the sun. We eat other animals or other vegetables or whatever it is, but everything ultimately eats something that is a plant. And in all the bottom of each food chain, when we eat the cow ate the grass, is some sort of a plant, like the grass. And the grass has to make food, and the grass makes the food through photosynthesis, through its own processes, by converting sunlight. No energy conversion is 100% efficient, and that's why things tend to get less and less efficient as you move along, and things tend to get more and more random and more spread out. Now, something has to facilitate the conversion of energy from potential energy to kinetic energy, and that is sometimes known as activation energy. A quick and simple example of something that we can think of that changes potential energy to kinetic energy. You have a rock at the top of a hill, and you have to push the rock in order to start rolling it, and then it picks up its own momentum and goes the rest of the way down the hill. So, of course, because of the fact that the rock was on the top of the hill, that it had a lot of potential energy. When it was rolling down the hill, it was using that potential energy and using kinetic energy to actually roll down the hill using the force of gravity. But when you pushed it originally, in order to get it started, then you were activating it. You were using that's called activation energy. Activation energy overcomes the repulsive electrical forces between electron shells so that they can move close enough together to react. In English, what this means in chemistry, in order for two things to combine, let's say a sodium and a chlorine, the electrons have to join together. The sodium has to lose an electron, and the chlorine has to gain an electron. I think, we discussed this a little bit earlier. Let's look at the diagram again. This is an example of a sodium chloride diagram. Remember, the sodium had 11 electrons originally, and the chlorine had 17. And the sodium gave away its electron, the yellow one, to the chlorine, which now has 18. Now, electrons in general are both negatively charged, and negatively charged forces repulse each other, just like positively charged forces repulse each other. Negatively charged forces also repulse each other. Now, so in order for this to happen, in order for this electron to move in and join with the chlorine's electrons, it had to overcome the repulsive force, because these electrons the green ones would normally repulse the yellow one. So in order to have them join up, and in order to become a sodium chloride, you need to have energy to overcome that. So anytime you have two atoms that are combining with each other, it means their electrons essentially are going to combine, and that's talking about whether you're talking about an ionic bond or a covalent bond. This basic idea is the same. That is, you need some sort of energy to overcome that repulsive force so that they join. Now, that can come from many different sources, but in general, when you're talking about life processes and combinations, it requires some sort of energy. A chemical reaction is any kind of a reaction that changes the atomic structure. It could be sodium and chlorine joining. It could be sodium and chlorine splitting apart. It could be hydrogen and oxygen joining. It could be methanes, the carbon and the hydrogens of methane splitting apart. Anything to that effect. Anything that breaks the chemical bonds that hold the atoms together, or, of course, the opposites, establishes the chemical bonds that hold things together, is called a chemical reaction. Now, a chemical reaction can need energy, like when you're taking two things and stuffing them together, so taking a sodium and taking a chlorine and stuffing them together and overcoming the repulsion that the electrons would normally meet with each other, then you need energy in order to do that. You also, on the other hand, could have reactions that release energy. There was pent-up energy when the sodium and the chlorine come apart. Well, then the energy that's no longer needed to overcome the repulsion between the electrons gets released into the environment. And those two different types of chemical reactions are called exothermic reactions or endothermic reactions. Exothermic reactions are when energy is released, whereas when an endothermic reaction, the energy is required to put in. An exothermic reaction produces energy, usually in the form of light or heat. Could be in other electromagnetic forms, but the release of energy is usually in the form of light or heat. And an endothermic reaction requires energy to put it in. Exothermic reactions release energy. Endothermic reactions gain energy. Exothermic reactions tend to make the surrounding environment hotter, whereas endothermic reactions tend to make the surrounding environment cooler. So, for example, when you put a log in a fireplace, you're hoping, and you're probably going to get, an exothermic reaction, because energy is released. The reactant has more energy than the product. Some of the extra energy that's being used gets released into the environment. Sometimes you actually have both of these reactions that are happening at the same time, and the exothermic reaction produces energy that fuels, or that establishes the energy necessary for the endothermic reaction. That's what's called a coupled reaction. Two reactions that provide energy one for the other. The exothermic reaction, which gives off energy, which releases energy, gives the energy needed to drive the endothermic reaction. Uses ATP or electron carriers as intermediaries. I don't want to worry about electron carriers. That has nothing to do with biology. But again, I've mentioned it many times. At some point, we should actually look at what they are. ATPs, which has an adenosine or an adenine and 3 phosphates, and that's a carrier of energy. Long story short, what the body does is it takes these ADPs, which has an adenine and 2 phosphates, and the mitochondria uses energy to take a 3rd phosphate and scrunch it in there to make it an ATP, make it an adenosine triphosphate. And then it spreads out through the rest of the cell, spreads out through wherever it's needed, and then the ATP can release one of its phosphates and give off the energy necessary for wherever it is to actually use. So, for example, the ATP has potential energy. When it moves back into an ADP, a diphosphate, by releasing one of the phosphates, that causes kinetic energy. As in forming an ATP, in other words, taking one with 2 phosphates and cramming in a 3rd one, is an endothermic reaction because it requires energy, whereas the releasing energy is an exothermic reaction because it releases energy. Okay. During photosynthesis, as an example, plants use the sunlight, which is an exothermic reaction. Of course, when the sun itself shines, that's an exothermic reaction because it's giving off energy, common sense. And it produces high-energy glucose molecules from low-energy reactants. The photosynthesis reaction is actually as follows over here. I'll just show you quickly. I don't want to get into this too much, but basically you get carbon dioxide and water. The plant needs that. It gets carbon dioxide from the air, it gets water from the ground and its roots from rain, plus energy from the sun, and it turns it into sugar and releases oxygen out into the atmosphere. Oxygen is a waste product, a byproduct of photosynthesis. So what it's doing is it's taking energy from the sun, and it's taken the carbon, actually you need 6 of these and 6 of these to create a glucose. And you're combining the carbon and oxygen from the carbon dioxide with the hydrogen from the water, making CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, which in these amounts, in the 6-12-6 ratio, is sugar. So this represents organic matter in plants. In other words, this is the thing that has potential energy. So what you're doing is you're taking things without potential energy, and you're using energy to make it into something with potential energy. By the way, so this photosynthetic reaction, this photosynthesis, can you tell me whether it's an exothermic or an endothermic? Now, obviously, you're not going to hear me, but if you want to pause it and think about it and let yourself know what you think it is, I'll tell you what it is in a moment. And of course, it is an endothermic reaction. It's not giving off energy, it is absorbing energy. Carbon dioxide and water needs energy in order to become glucose. It's taking energy and it's storing it as potential energy in glucose. It's adding energy, and therefore that is an endothermic reaction. Okay, in fact it says over here on the slide, endothermic synthesis of high glucose water, of high energy glucose, which means sugar, and by taking carbon dioxide and water. In chemistry in general, you need a catalyst in order to establish a chemical reaction. A catalyst is something that increases the chances that a reaction will happen or facilitates a reaction. So a catalyst moves up the rate of reaction without being permanently altered by the reaction. Catalysts can be things like heat or other types of chemicals. It could be a catalyst could be a wide variety of different types of things. So catalysts can speed up reactions by lowering the activation energy. Remember, you need activation energy in order to establish any kind of reaction, but certain catalysts, high acidity, other types of molecules, things like that, can allow something to be created a little bit more, can allow a reaction to be activated more easily. An example, the hydrolysis of sucrose to glucose and fructose. Hydrolysis, remember, means breaking something up by adding water to of a disaccharide, something that has two sugar molecules in it, to a monosaccharide like sucrose or fructose, is spontaneous. But if you dissolve it in water and keep the solution at room temperature, it will not happen unless there is at least some sort of catalyst to lower the activation energy. In other words, some things just simply won't happen. There won't be enough energy for them to occur unless you add some sort of a catalyst to make things more to allow things to dissolve or allow things to react more so than they would otherwise. Catalysts can speed up both kinds of reactions, endothermic and exothermic, but again, remember, an endothermic reaction, which requires energy, still requires some energy. No matter how much of a catalyst you add to it, it's still got to have some energy in order to actually form the reaction. The things that are catalysts inside your body, and really the entire point of catalysts as far as this course goes, is the enzymes. An enzyme are protein molecules, and they are in each of our individual cells. They're all over our body. There are millions and millions and maybe billions of them that are floating around our bodies, and they're in each individual cells, and they are probably, well, more than billions. Billions is a dramatic understatement. There are many, many. Anyway, there's a lot. Enzymes are proteins that are in the cell that allow materials to be broken apart, put back together, and various other types of chemical reactions that are necessary in order for the life processes to be done. Enzymes are made of proteins, and they are highly specific for molecules to which they attach. The molecule to which they attach are sometimes called their substrate. Substrate means something that is worked on by an enzyme. The enzymes, in fact, are usually named for their substrate. The enzyme that works on glucose is called glucase. The enzyme that works on DNA is called DNase. And the enzyme that works on lipids is called lipase. Basically, they just call it with an ASE at the end based on whatever its substrate is. An enzyme could be used many times for the same kind of reaction over and over again, and it could be regulated by other factors. They have to have the correct site. They have to have the enzyme has to be the same shape. We'll see the diagram in a minute. And they cause the reactions on their substrates, which are the molecules that are reactants, which are the molecules that actually act. The substrates and the active site change shape, and they form what is sometimes called the lock and key model. Now that means nothing in a vacuum, but it should hopefully mean something when you look at a diagram like this. Over here, you've got the enzyme and the substrate, and note that they fit into one another. They call that the lock and key model because it's like a lock fitting into a key. You have the substrate, the purple thing, fits perfectly into the enzyme. The enzyme is specifically designed to have the correct shape to react with this particular substrate. This is an example of a full reaction where the enzyme needs to break apart this substrate. The substrate is the triangle combined with the circle, and eventually you're going to want to break it apart. And the way that works is they have to fit perfectly into the enzyme. The enzyme then performs the reaction by breaking it apart, and there you go. And the same thing is true the opposite, where you have two substrates coming in here, and they eventually combine to form one product. Now, enzyme activity is, of course, necessary for human life, but they are influenced by certain factors. Poisons and some drugs sometimes inhibit enzymes functioning. In some ways it could be good if the enzymes are overreacting and doing things that are making people uncomfortable or unhealthy, but more often than not, inhibiting enzymes is a bad thing because enzymes cannot do the work that they need to do. Proper pH levels, which is acidity. Acidity is usually measured on a pH scale of 0 to 14, with 0 being most acidic and 14 being most basic, which means the opposite of acidic. Also, temperature is another example of something that impacts the ability of the enzymes to operate. Salt concentration, again, other things necessary, all that impact the ability of enzymes to operate. As far as temperature goes, and the reason why, first of all, acidity, cellular enzymes work best at a pH level of 7.3, which is about neutral. So if you get too acidic inside your body or too basic inside your body, that's not good. Most human enzymes work best at about 98.6 Fahrenheit, 37 Celsius. That's normal body temperature. If you get too hot, you have a fever, or too cold, that's also not good, principally because the enzymes aren't going to be able to work as well. And in essence, when the enzyme's conditions are outside the normal range, they become denatured, or denatured. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But anyway, they become a little bit off-kilter in terms of their shape, and they don't work as well. For an example, when an enzyme normally has a maximum activity at 57, but once it's heated to 150 and back down to 57, it still might not work, because if it's heated up too much, it could be distorted. So in other words, just because you bring it back to the way it was originally doesn't mean you automatically heal the enzyme. The enzyme might have been, think of a crayon. If you heat it up too hot and it melts, and then you cool it back off, it'll refreeze, but it won't refreeze into the same shape as was originally. And remember, enzymes require their shape in order to properly react for their substrate. This is an example of the reaction of different types of enzymes. This is just one example. Let's say you have over here a graph. Let's say this is pH level, 0 being most acidic, 14 being the opposite of acidic, which is basic. And the orange is probably most enzymes in the human body that they react terribly at 0. Then when you go up to 7, they react very well at a little over 7. And then as you get further and further away from 7, they get worse and worse. But then there are other types of enzymes that might work, or other types of reactants that might work better in much lower acidic, much more acidic, or much less acidic environments. And inhibition means you're stopping the enzymes for whatever reason. You're stopping the enzymes from functioning. It could be based on competitive inhibition, which means something else is reacting with those substrates just as well. In other words, let's say if you want some sort of a medicine that stops enzymes from reacting in a certain way, one way to do it is to introduce something into the cell that is going to lock on to those same substrates, but just not do whatever the enzyme would do. Now, if that happens, the substrates just aren't going to. There aren't going to be as many substrates available to react with the enzymes. That's one way to establish to use something to block enzyme activity. And you can also use non-competitive inhibition, which binds to the site of the enzyme. In other words, competitive inhibition is when you bind to the substrate to just use up all the substrates, or you can bind to the enzyme to take the enzymes out of action, because once the enzymes are bound to something that is not the substrate they're supposed to react on, they're not available to react on the substrate itself. Okay, so let's take a look at some multiple choice for the end of this chapter. Which of the following does not have much potential energy? A. A water drop at the top of a waterfall. That sounds like it has a lot of potential energy, right? Because as it's going down the waterfall, it's going to release a tremendous amount of energy as it's going all the way down, so that certainly has a lot of potential energy. A glucose molecule does have a lot of potential energy, because remember, it is energy stored in it that the body can use in order to establish energy for the body. C, a bowling ball that has stopped rolling down the lane. Well, it's on flat ground, and it's not rolling, which means it really doesn't have any potential energy, so that seems right. A diver on a springboard certainly does have potential energy, because he or she can jump off the diving board and go to the ground and very fast. And a AA battery certainly has a lot of stored energy. It can be used for energy. So the only one that does not have potential energy would be choice C. And next question, which of the following is the best description of a chemical reaction? Two reactions that occur simultaneously. Well, again, that there could be coupled reactions, but they don't necessarily have to be. That's not much of a description. A reaction that occurs right after another reaction. Again, not necessarily. It could be a sole reaction. Two reactions that occur in the same organelle, same problem. Reactions that occur during sexual reproduction, and nothing to do with anything. A process that forms or breaks the chemical bonds that hold atoms together. Yep, that sounds like a reaction, and so, therefore, that seems like it's the only one that answers the question, and therefore the answer is choice E.